The scorching Arizona sun bore down on Redemption Creek like the judgment of an angry god, but inside the whitewashed church, the air stayed cool and pine-scented, a hush stitched together by dust motes and quiet prayer. Sarah Mae Thornton knelt at the rail, bonnet pins warm against her scalp, big palms pressed together with the easy practice of a woman raised on hymns and hard rules. At 22, she carried obedience like a shawl, useful, familiar, heavy. The Reverend's daughter knew each knot in the pews, each squeak in the floorboards, each verse that could be slipped between fear and the skin. She knew how to be still. She did not yet know how to be seen. Hoofbeats rolled along the hard-packed street, a slow thunder that turned heads. Sarah Mae looked up despite herself. Through the wavy glass of the tall windows she saw the stallion first, black as a spilled inkpot, breath like steam in the heat. Then the man swung down from the saddle in a single unbothered motion, and stillness became a stranger. He was a giant by any town measure, long lines cut from labor and sun, shoulders that made the fabric of his dusty shirt strain, forearms that spoke fluent work. His thighs gripped the horse with the casual intimacy of 1,000 miles ridden. The brim of his hat shadowed his face, but the set of his mouth said he was not a man who apologized to weather or men. He turned slightly, and in the wavering glass their eyes met, hers wide and startled, his the amber of a good whiskey held to light. Something low in her belly clenched. The sensation was new and not small. It startled a breath from her and sent heat skimming over her brown cheeks. She'd been told plenty about sin, how it sidled, how it snared, how it masqueraded as honey. No one had told her that wanting could feel like waking up. Sarah Mae's body, soft and generous, hips that made skirts honest, breasts that dared buttons, hands broad from kitchen and nursery, had been counted against her often enough to make her tuck herself away. She had learned to fold her laughter, to shrink her angles, to take up less of the aisle. But the giant outside looked at her through the ripple glass as if her muchness were a promise instead of a problem, and the idea shocked her into stillness as complete as any prayer. She tried to lower her gaze. It lifted again of its own accord. He ran a palm down the stallion's neck, work rough, tender, and checked the cinch, his movements clean and economical. There was nothing lewd in the way he moved. There was plenty that knew itself. When he tipped his hat in that small, respectful arc, the gesture slid across her skin like a warm hand. Words fled. The familiar prayers frayed. Her heart hammered a rhythm meant for running. She pressed her thighs together, not understanding the ache that pulsed there, only that it existed and seemed to answer something in the man like an echo to his call. Shame pricked, an old, well-worn thorn. It did not bite as deep as the wonder. The side door whispered open behind her. Her father's steps cut the hush, measured, absolute. The Reverend Josiah Thornton carried scripture like a cudgel. The temper of a man who believed he was the sole instrument of a holy will lived behind his pale eyes. He stepped to the chancel with his jaw set, a sermon already sharpening on his tongue. Sarah Mae rose, hands smoothing her skirt out of habit as much as hope, and turned toward him. Another shadow filled the doorway. The cowboy had taken off his hat at the threshold. He did not belong in a church, and yet the small space did not seem to know how to deny him. He brought the horizon inside with him, all that open, unbothered patience. The room shrank around his size, but did not make him smaller. His gaze, when it found Sarah Mae again, was steady and impossibly relieved, as though the sight of her was what he had ridden into town for without knowing it. "Reverend," the stranger said, voice a deep, even thing that seemed to rumble out of the floorboards, "I came to speak with you about your daughter." The words hit the air like a bell struck hard.
Sarah May saw color rise and fall in her father's face, heard the snap of breath before the scald. "You will not profane this house with—" "Sir," the man said, respectful without ceding an inch, "I aim no disrespect. My name is Cole Maverick. I'd ask permission to call on Miss Thornton proper." Proper. The word should have soothed, it only stoked. The Reverend's hand lifted, the same hand that had corrected, commanded, condemned. The belt hanging in the study, silent as a snake, seemed to hiss in memory. Sarah May felt the old obedience like a yoke across her shoulders, and beneath it, something else, a simple, stubborn line of self she had never let fully stand. Cole shifted his weight, not threatening, just inserting the fact of his body between the pulpit and the woman behind him, as if his bones understood shelter. He kept his eyes on the Reverend, but pitched his voice so Sarah May would hear it clear. "Miss," he said, the smallest question braided into the word, "do you want me to go or stay?" No one had asked her that before, not in those terms, not where choice meant more than which pie to serve at a social. The church held its breath. Outside, a dust devil danced itself thin and vanished. Sarah May's mouth went dry. She thought of the little house behind the church where a tired mother mended in silence, of the thin comfort of being a good girl, of boys her father preferred because they were pale, pious, and petty. She thought of her body, her brown softness, her laughter she kept folded, her steadiness she gave away as duty. She thought of amber eyes through glass. She thought, for once, of what she wanted. "I want to hear him," she said, surprised by the calm in her own voice. Her father's mouth thinned into a blade. "You will obey me." Cole did not move. "She is obeying the truth she spoke," he answered, and Sarah May felt something in her lift its head and look around, startled by the light. The Reverend turned that blade of a mouth on her. "You will go home." The old rope of prayer slipped into her hands again, but it wasn't the one with knots for penance. It was a clean strand, bright with a new, plain plea. "Let me choose." She took a breath that filled her lungs all the way, felt her ribs widen, felt herself expand to the size she truly was. When she looked up, she met the giant's gaze without flinching. "Stay," she said. "Speak." The sound that scraped out of her father could have been grief if there had been love in it. The sentence landed like thrown iron. And yet, beneath the bruise, was that other feeling, the one she had tasted in the glance through glass, the sweetness of waking. She did not reach for her father. She did not beg. She stood. Her muchness stayed with her. Cole lifted his hat, not to hide his face, but to witness hers. He did not offer eloquence. He offered fact. "I'll see to her well-being," he said, each word hammered slow. "I'll put my name to it if she lets me. I'll ride on if she doesn't." The Reverend's silence turned colder than a January creek. The choice, at last, was naked in the aisle between them. Sarah May looked from one man to the other, the one who held law like a cudgel, the one who held restraint like a virtue, and found that her feet knew the path before her mind had finished the map. When she stepped forward, it was into her own life, and the church, surprised, did not stop her.
The street outside the church shimmered, carrying hoofbeats and whispers in the same breath. Sarah May stepped into it with her chin high and her palms trembling, the door thudding behind her like a verdict she refused. Cole Maverick matched her pace without crowding, hat in one hand, the other open, a promise she could take or leave. At the hitching rail, the stallion tossed its head. Cole soothed the animal with a palm down the neck, then looked to Sarah May as if the horse's temper mattered less than hers. "Say the word," he said, voice low. "I'll put you back at that door and ride on. Your choice." Her heartbeat was a fist against her ribs. She thought of the narrow house behind the church, of her mother's stooped tenderness, of the belt that bought silence. She thought of amber eyes through rippled glass and how they had made her feel full-sized for the first time. "I'm done being smaller than I am," she said, and put her hand in his. He lifted her as if the day weighed nothing, setting her sideways on the saddle before swinging up behind. His arm banded her waist, firm and careful. "Ready?" he asked. She was afraid. She was ready. She nodded, and he put the horse to a steady jog that ate the distance between the life she knew and a life that might belong to her. Redemption Creek narrowed to a strip of white and opinion. Ahead lay ochre and sage. At first, she sat stiff, hyper-aware of every point where their bodies met, the rock of the saddle, the warmth of his thighs, the tide of his breath at her nape. The rhythm worked through her like a psalm, loosening what fear had cinched tight. When she shifted to ease a pinch at her hip, she felt him, solid and undeniable, and blushed at her awareness. "Don't borrow trouble," he murmured. "We've got miles to go." "I wasn't thinking—" "Liar," he said, fondly, and she shocked herself by laughing. The sound felt like a bird sprung free. They rode until the sun lost some teeth. A seam of rocks offered shade. Cole dismounted and lifted her down, hands steady at her waist, a heartbeat longer than necessary, less claim than kindness. The ground rolled under her feet, a trick of muscles unlearning the horse. She steadied herself with a palm to his chest. He watered the stallion, then sat beside her and offered jerky and a tin cup. "Say if you want quiet," he said. She shook her head. "If I'm quiet now, I'll burst." Words spilled like beads freed from a string, of small obediences and large hurts, of dresses meant to erase rather than hold, of laughter pressed flat because someone decided it was too much. She spoke of the way his question in the church had opened a door, and how stepping through had filled her lungs with air she hadn't known she'd missed. He listened without fixing. When she finished, he nodded as if shelving something precious. "I've wanted 1,000 things I never said. A winter without loss. Land that answers to my name. A woman who meets my eyes and doesn't flinch at the size of me or my wanting." "I didn't flinch," she said. "I saw." His mouth hitched. "I'm rough. I've done what a man must, but I won't take what isn't offered. I won't talk you smaller, and I won't leave you guessing." "What do you feel?" she asked. "Like I rode in to buy cattle and found the rest of my life kneeling in a church." The frankness sank into her like rain on thirsty ground. She threaded her fingers through his. "I want the rest of my life to be my own. If it's with you, it's because I choose it." "Then choose it one day at a time," he said, "starting here." Wind combed the scrub. He leaned in slowly enough that she could turn away. She didn't. His mouth touched her forehead first, undoing an old knot. When he kissed her lips, it was gentle. Smoke, tin cup water, a sip after a hard ride. Want moved through her like a fuse. He ended it before the edges blurred, resting his brow to hers. "We'll find a preacher when we're ready. Loud if you want, quiet if you prefer. If the world names you ruined, I'll build you a life where it means reborn." The sky went from brass to violet. One star woke, then 3. Sarah May watched them spark and thought how a decision had redrawn her map. She was frightened. She was free. She walked at her full height into whatever came next, a giant, steady hand warm around her own.
Night fell over the desert, and the wind remembered to be kind. Cole chose a hollow that shouldered the gusts and made camp without hurry. Sarah May watched as the last ribbons of sun went out. He was so large the shadows fit around him, yet every motion was careful, as if he'd rather calm a skittish coat than impress the dark. He unsaddled the stallion, rubbed him dry, checked hooves by feel, and led the animal to a moon-silvered pool. Then he coaxed a small fire into being. Its light loosened a knot in Sarah May's chest. She sat on the blanket he'd spread and untied her bonnet, setting it aside like a rule she no longer owed. Her hair sprang free in a black halo. She felt her body as weight that belonged to her, as softness that deserved space. The gray drafts tugged over hips and chest. For once the pull did not feel like a scold. Cole brought jerky and a tin cup. "Say if you'd rather quiet," he said, seating himself with a respectful space. "If I keep silence now, I'll burst," she answered. He angled toward her. She told him what the church never wanted: a mother stooped by duty, a father whose scripture wore iron shoes, the way she learned to tuck laughter into her sleeve and shrink to fit men's comfort. She spoke of the glance through wavering glass, how one look felt like sunlight in a locked room. He didn't try to fix anything. "I grew up on other men's land, took orders till I had dollars and scars to shape my own. I thought I was done wanting anything I couldn't build with my hands. Then I saw you." Heat rose in her cheeks. "If I am wanted," she said, steady, "it will be as I am, black, big, soft, stubborn." Recognition, not mockery, touched his mouth. "You will not be made less by me." He hesitated. "May I kiss you?" The question steadied her more than any sermon. She nodded. He came close, careful. One palm warmed her jaw, and his breath was cedar and smoke. The first press of his lips was patient. Something loosened through her shoulders. The ache that had sparked hours ago became invitation. He kissed her again, deeper. The world narrowed to the drag of his mouth. When she parted for him, his tongue brushed hers, careful, tasting, and she sighed. He drank the sound like water. In those passes, they learned each other without hurry. When he drew away, both were breathing like they'd climbed a hill. He kept his hand on her cheek, thumb over the flutter of her pulse. "You doing all right?" he asked. "I am wanting." "Me too." He tipped his head toward the small buttons at her bodice. "May I?" Her heart stampeded and then steadied. "You may." He worked the buttons with careful fingers, not rushing her courage. Fabric eased. Cool air met warm skin. The thin chemise clung, honest about shape and heat. She flinched at the reflex to cover, then saw his face and went still. Awe gentled him. Pride, hers, rose. "You're beautiful," he said, and it felt like fact. "Touch me," she asked. He did. Maps before roads, palms before claim. He learned the curve of her waist and the giving strength of her belly, the lift and weight of her breasts, the tender sensitivity where fabric rasped at pebbled peaks. He did not squeeze her smaller. He held her as she was. Each time he tried a new path, he asked, "Here? Like this?" and revised himself to her answers. When his hand slid to the slope of her thigh and lower, resting over the heat he had helped wake, she arched into his palm. "Tell me no and I stop." She shook her head, and he stroked her through cotton, slow circles that found a rhythm older than language. Her breath broke into small, astonished pieces. She pressed her forehead to his shoulder. Pleasure gathered and pressed. At the edge, he stilled and kissed her temple. "Not tonight," he whispered. "Not under the open where you learn to be afraid. When there's a roof you chose, with a promise made, we'll go further. I can wait." Frustration flared, then melted into trust she could lie down in. She exhaled a laugh she hadn't known she carried. "You're cruel," she teased. "I'm yours," he said. He buttoned her back into herself, set his coat around her shoulders. Stars blinked on like yeses. Sarah May lay with her head on his upper arm and her palm over his heart, and felt the engine promise what his mouth had not. She slept not like a fugitive,
but like a woman who had been asked and had finally answered.
Evening gathered Copper Falls into soft colors, orange guttering to rose, rose thinning to lavender, while the little church on the hill held the last of the light in its tall windows. Sarah May stepped inside on legs that remembered saddles and new courage. Cole Maverick followed with his hat in his hands and his shoulders unconsciously squared, as if meeting a storm he welcomed. The preacher, a weathered man whose kindness had the matter-of-fact look of an old quilt, listened to their names and their wish. His wife pinched a candle wick, poured water for a dry-throated bride, and nodded like they had seen this kind of urgency before and knew it could be holy. There were no flowers, no ribbons, no choir. There were 2 calloused hands and 2 bright intentions. When the vows were spoken, Sarah May heard her own voice as if for the first time, clear, adult, certain. She did not tremble. She took him, and he took her, not away from something, but into something, into the work of a shared life they meant to build board by board and season by season. "You may kiss your bride," the preacher said, and Cole did not as a performance, but as a seal, steady and warmed by awe. Outside, the bell gave one surprised note. Inside, the preacher's wife wiped at her eyes with the back of her wrist and wished them good shelter, good harvests, good sense. Copper Falls had a hotel with clean sheets and a proprietor who knew when to hand over a key and keep his counsel. Cole set corn down, set his palm at the small of Sarah May's back, and led her up narrow stairs that creaked like old friends clearing their throats. The room was simple, a bed like a small raft, a washstand with a cracked bowl, a window with curtain lace browned by desert sun. The door shut. The bolt slid with a gentle finality that felt less like a barricade than a benediction. They stood a moment without touching, both smiling in the foolish, grateful way of people surprised to find themselves exactly where they hoped to be. Cole set his hat on the chair and reached for nothing but words first. "Mrs. Maverick," he said, tasting it like a blessing. "Mr. Maverick," she answered, and the name fit both their mouths. He came to her then, but not fast. His size made the room small. His care made it safe. He lifted her hand, kissed the back of it in a way so old-fashioned it tipped over in the fresh, then pressed that hand to his chest, where his heart worked hard and honest. "Tell me how to go. I'll go that way." Sarah May had been asked many questions in her life, about linens and hymns and meals, but never this one. It balanced everything, her wants, his promises, the road they'd taken here. She took inventory of the tremors in her belly and the steadiness in her spine, and she heard the clean strand of the day's new prayer, "Let me choose." Slow and true. He nodded as if she laid down a law he was glad to obey. He unhooked the buttons of a dress with the same small patience he used for stubborn tack, careful of thread, careful of skin. When the gray fell away and the white beneath breathed the contours of a body the world had taught her to hide, he looked at her like a man who'd crossed the desert to find a spring and meant to cup water in both hands, not waste a drop. "You are so much," he said, soft and reverent. "I'm grateful." She laughed then, bright, disbelieving and relieved, and that sound cleared the last haze of shame from the room. She stood full height in her muchness, black and soft and strong and beautiful, and invited him closer with a nod. He came. His hands learned her as if reading, not skimming. His mouth found hers as if arriving, not hunting. When he lifted her and set her on the bed, the mattress whispered. When he braced his weight above her, the frame complained and then settled into a new, inevitable song. He asked at every turn. She answered at every turn. Where the world had tried to talk her small, he praised her large. Where old fear flinched, he waited until new trust put its palm over that place and said, "It's all right." When hesitation rose, she said so and watched him slow. When confidence rose, she said that too and watched him meet it. What had been a secret, her own wanting, became a language they shared, speaking it in murmurs and breath and laughter that startled them both. There was heat, there was reverence, there was the bright shock of firsts and the steady thrum of yes threaded through each of them. When they reached the tender threshold places that asked for care, they paused and breathed and walked through together, hands clasped like a promise continued. What happened after belonged to them in the quiet rafters. It did not require witnesses or instruction, only the simple ledger of two adults who had chosen and were choosing still. Yes, yes, yes. Later, time gone syrupy and good, Sarah May lay on her side with her back tucked into Cole's front, his arm a warm, possessive band across her middle. He traced idle, thoughtless patterns along the curve of her hip, the rhythm less acclaimed than a gratitude his hands didn't know how to hold still. The window admitted a sliver of moonlight that turned the room pewter and kind. Somewhere on the street below, a piano tried to remember a hymn and turned it into a waltz. "You all right?" he asked at last, voice gone hoarse with joy and caution both. She considered, because truth deserved precision. She felt used, in the best, oldest sense of the word, like a tool that had finally been put to the work it was made for. She felt seen without being measured and held without being handled. She felt sore where brand new things ought to announce themselves and lit in places shame had tried to darken. "I am more than all right," she said, and heard how that echoed the church vows in her own tone. "I am home." He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. It was relief wearing happiness. "You remember what I promised?" he teased after a while, mouth near the bend of her shoulder. "About every inch, and you're walking tomorrow." She snorted into the pillow, the motion shaking his arm where it lay across her. "Braggart." "Archivist," he corrected. "I keep records of my vows." "Then keep this one," she said, turning to face him, palm to his jaw. "Keep all of them. Not the words you can shout in a saloon, the quiet ones. Bread on the table, hands to the work, patience when wheat is long, laughter when the calf gets loose in the kitchen, respect, asking, my name said like you mean it." "Yes, ma'am." They drowsed, they woke and kissed again. They spoke of small tomorrows, supplies at dawn, the road north, fences that needed mending. A house Sarah May tried to picture and couldn't yet, and loved anyway. He told her the line of the hills he called home. She told him the names she'd give them when she got there. When sleep finally took them, it did so gently, like a quilt pulled up by someone who knows where you're ticklish and where you're tender. In the morning, sun found them tangled and unwilling to hurry. Sarah May swung her feet to the floor and wobbled, hand finding the bedpost, laughter finding the hair. Cole, wicked and pleased and deeply tender, crossed the room in 2 strides, lifted her as if she weighed nothing, and set her back in the warm dent of the mattress. "I keep records," he said again, and kissed the corner of her smile. "And I pay my debts." "Then pay this one," she said, bold because the night had taught her how, "in coffee first." "Yes, ma'am," he said, scandalized, delighted. "Coffee and the rest of the ledger after."
Spring wrote green along the low hills, as if the land had dipped its thumb in paint and dragged color across every fold. Sarah May rode beside Cole now, not in front of him, thighs strong around a stout bay mare who answered her hands like the mare had decided to believe in her. They had left Copper Falls with a marriage folded neat into their pockets and the memory of clean sheets in their bones. They carried coffee, biscuits wrapped in a towel, and plans they spoke aloud like maps. Montana rose up the longer they rode, blue shadow mountains shouldering the sky, creek water talking bright over stones, wind that smelled of pine and distance. The first sight of the ranch landed in Sarah May's chest with a thump. A long, low house, not fancy, but certain. A corral line true, a cluster of outbuildings with roofs that looked like they'd learned weather and would not panic at it. Beyond, cattle stippled the slope like punctuation. Men on the fence turned at the thunder of hooves and went still. Then the foreman, Sam,
whip thin and grin wide, eyes crinkled by a lifetime of squinting into sun he loved, strode forward with a laugh that made the yard remember its manners. "Look what the winter blew back," he called. "Thought you were bones picked clean by buzzards, Cole Maverick." Then his gaze cut to Sarah May and softened into respect, some quick calculation rearranging itself. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat, "welcome home, if that's what this is." "It is," Sarah May said, and the word fit her tongue like something it had been waiting to say. The house smelled like cedar and clean work. The first nights were a tumble of exhaustion and discovery, where the floor creaked, how the stove breathed, which window admitted morning like a friend instead of an alarm. In the yard, days began with steam from coffee cups and the scrape of chairs across the porch. They ended with men's voices braided with coyote song. Sarah May learned the ranch by touch and repetition, the way doe wanted more water when the wind came hard from the west, how to tuck a blanket around a calf shaking with its first minutes, the exact tone of Cole's hoe that untied a nervous horse. She found she liked the weight of a ledger in her palm and the power of saying eat and having a table of hungry men sit and do as told. Respect arrived early and grew. It felt different than deference, earned from competence, not extracted from fear. Evenings, they split the quiet between them. Cole kept his promises in 100 small ways that made something large. He asked, he listened, he worked. He laughed the way a man does when the worst of loneliness he'd taught himself to ignore finally breaks and leaves him lighter. They argued sometimes about where to put a gate, about how many favors to extend to a man who'd drunk through 2 chances, about which hymn was proper for a Sunday when the wind wouldn't stop its foolishness. The arguments never turned into theater. They put their hands back on the same job by the end of them and counted that as victory. When nausea found Sarah May one morning like a prankster, she sat on the porch step with her palms braced against the plank and grinned at the far hills until her eyes wet. "Well then," she said to the air, and to the small secret rearranging her from the inside. Cole found her there and knew before she spoke. The knowledge opened his face like sun breaking fog. He knelt as if the boards had told him to use reverence and pressed his mouth to her brown belly, though there was hardly a swell for his lips to find. "Thank you," he said, to her, to the child, to whatever had guided him into a church on a hot day. Gratitude remade the yard around them. Winter held teeth that year. Snow shouldered up to the windows. The corrals turned into chores that argued back. Men moved in a choreography of necessity. Chop, haul, feed, thaw, check, repeat. Inside, the house became a warm engine that ran because Sarah May willed it to. Pots humming on the stove, biscuits landing on plates, socks steaming on a line strung by the stove's pipe. Cole shook the cold from his coat in the doorway at dusk and brought the storm's sharp smell into the room like a warning and a dare. He warmed hands at the kettle, then at the place where her child grew, talking to both of them about fences and calves and the way the creek sang different under ice. He had not been raised to tenderness. He acquired it like a skill and wore it like a habit. On a June morning when the air tasted of clover and dust, the baby came in a labor that made the world narrow to breath and the will to hold it to. Sarah May cursed in a way that would have made the old church clutch its pearls, and discovered that the Almighty, if listening, had a sense of humor. Cole's palm anchored her back. His voice found a pitch that steadied her spine. The midwife worked like a general. When the small, furious body thundered the air with its first complaint, time snapped, and then rethreaded itself with 3 names on it instead of 2. The boy was placed on Sarah May's chest, hot and blinking and outraged by existence. Joy turned every bruise to light. "Daniel," Cole whispered, because he wanted a name that meant judgment belonged not to men but to something merciful and huge. Sarah May kissed the crown of the child and felt the rim of her old life crumble like stale bread. The years walked forward with their usual stubbornness. Another child joined, and another, each arriving with their own weather and teaching. Sarah May's body told the story of it.
hip prints of tiny heels, laugh lines bitten into by sun, the proud ache of muscles that kept the house and herd moving. She rode beside Cole to check the far pasture and reined in when she pleased. She taught the men that kindness and standards share a long table. Sundays sometimes meant a hymn hummed over biscuits rather than any pew. When there were baptisms, they were in the creek, with cattle curious at a distance. Letters came from her mother, thin sheets heavy with apology and habit. She read them by the window and answered with love where love was offered, letting guilt fall like chaff. On a gold evening, years unspooled behind them like a good rope, they stood on the porch and watched their children invent a game with a hoop and stick, the dog adjudicating with the seriousness of a judge. The mountains wore sunset like a shawl. Cole folded himself around Sarah May from behind, arms crossing her belly with a familiarity that still felt like a miracle. "You remember Copper Falls?" he asked, mouth near her temple. "I remember most of it. Some parts are hazy on purpose." He laughed into her hair, and she felt the sound along her scalp, down her spine, to the places that had first woken the day she met him through the glass. "You told me I'd keep quiet promises," she said after a bit. "You did. Bread, work, patience, laughter, respect, asking. My name said like you mean it." He tightened his hold. "You told me to build you a life where the world's judgment can't find you." "We did." A breeze lifted the porch's lace curtain. Somewhere down by the creek, frogs began their evening brag. Daniel whooped at a victory his siblings disputed. Sarah May laid her hand over Cole's and felt the bones under his skin, the strength that had never once asked her to be smaller than she was. She had learned to walk at her full height, to claim space with her hips and her laugh and her yes and her no. The girl in the church window had turned into a woman's whose life fit her. Night came in easy. She turned in his arms and kissed him, not the fevered proof of a first promise, but the patient confirmation of a long one. "Come tuck the babies," she said. "Come keep me from walking too straight tomorrow." He grinned, that wicked, worshipful blend he'd perfected, and let her lead him inside where their house held heat and history. The door shut with the soft click of a vow renewed, and the wind, for once, did not argue.